Hey, what's up, Exit the Matrix family? Bob here. Hope you guys are having a great day. Thank you for joining me on this morning talk. Hey guys, I'm just gonna go with the flow today on this talk. I guess essentially I wanted to talk about, why are we here? As you guys know, typically I kind of let the universe direct my talks each day. What comes into my head, and it essentially I get direction. I don't know if that's your higher self or your intuition, whatever you want to call it, but I've been thinking a lot, just watching NDE accounts and looking into what they're finding, under the Great Pyramid. All these crazy things that are happening, all this evidence coming out about Tartaria and technology. And I mentioned like the orphan trains, back in the early 1800s and stuff. And just, you look at the World Fair and all these grand buildings, and they say, oh, they were just made out of wood and plaster and stuff, and I mean, just all this stuff. There's so much stuff coming out that's just rewriting what we see as history. And then, of course, we're moving into this era with the quantum physics and the AI and the robots, and I mean, everything is just moving so fast. I mean, I watched a video on robots that now these things are getting so articulate that they can do karate and stuff. I mean, these things can flip around. They went from being clunky and trying to mimic what humans can do to now some of these robots they're designing are more dexterous than a human being, than a top athlete. And this is going to continue. They're going to be stronger, faster than humans. They're going to have AI minds. Sometimes I feel like we're doing exactly what the Inuna did with the Homo sapien. That in their zest to take the load off of the gods, the workload off of the gods, and fashion, the Homo sapien, the atom, to take over the labors, that they fashioned it too well. And when you read about Adapa, and when he's sent to Anu, because the Anunnaki are marveling at how advanced this Adapa was. In Adapa, for those of you who don't know, he was like the first Adam. But he was far advanced. And, of course, that was what infuriated Enlil, that his brother Ea Enki had made this Adapa so advanced. And then, of course, this worker class, this worker prototype, the Homo sapien, started outbreeding the Anunnaki. It started spreading out, eating all the food of the land, and it was out of control. It was they had to design civilization to control this Homo sapien, but even that, they were losing control of it. And there were few of them and many of this Homo sapien. And so, of course, Enlil ordered the flood to be brought to wipe out humanity. But Ea Enki, him and his sister Ninma, their experiment, their creation was so dear to them that they couldn't allow them to be totally wiped out. And of course, that's where Ea Enki goes to Ziusudra also known as Noah in the Bible, and he warns them of the flood, gives them instructions on how to build the ark. And different from the biblical magical story of bringing 2 of every species on earth, 2 cockroaches, 2 wolves, 2 lions. He was commanded to bring agricultural animals and seeds, agricultural seeds and stuff like that on board the ark. And it wasn't just his family, it was subjects from his... He was a king. Noah was a king, folks. It doesn't tell you that in the Bible. He was the king of Shrupak, an ancient city-state. And he was ordered to build the ark, but to bring agricultural animals and seeds and crops on board. It wasn't saving every species on earth. It was that to prepare for when the floods receded, that they could rebuild civilization, and that they had the food crops and the animals to raise to reestablish, right? But he also brought some of his subjects on board. Everybody always says, well, how did all these people come from just Noah's inbreeding family, right? But yet then when they later on find out that there are other humans that survived the flood, right? So even the Bible contradicts itself. But anyways, in the cuneiform version, the Atrahasis, and you can find it talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh and such. And there's other tablets too that go into detail about the flood. Well, it wasn't just Ziusudra and his family, but there were some of his subjects, the ones that heeded the warning of the flood and that got on board with them. So they did have enough of a genetic pool to start rebuilding after the flood, after probably millions were wiped out, or who knows. Now, was this all story about the flood that wiped out Atlantis or the Cataclysm? It could be. This could be a much older story than Sumer. This could go back to Göbekli Tepe time, 13,000 years instead of 6,000 years. This could go back even further. It could be the story of Atlantis. But folks, we are learning with what they're discovering in Egypt with these newer advanced LiDAR imaging scans that they're doing underneath the Great Pyramid and such, that there are megalithic structures. I mean, the structures underneath the pyramid are bigger than the pyramid. It's like the pyramid's the capstone to this technology. So we're starting to have all this uncovered. We're having Göbekli uncovered, Karahan Tepe, stuff around Lake Van and stuff that like Matthew LaCroix and Billy Carson and a lot of these group of these the kind of non-academic, these amateur researchers and seekers are looking at like that for one, we're already pushing back the hunter-gatherer bullshit, right? See, look here, folks, here's the thing. Even during a time of Atlantis, when you could have had a worldwide advanced civilization, you could still have pockets of people living like hunter-gatherers around the earth. Look, folks, even with the advancements of the, Asian countries and the Western countries and, some of the Middle Eastern countries, like Dubai and stuff like that, Saudi Arabia, all these advanced nations on earth, and you still have people living as hunter-gatherers in Africa and Asia and South America, on islands around Australia and such. I mean, look, folks, the story of Atlantis is that an advanced civilization got wiped out by a cataclysm. Whether it was that a pole shift, was that a, something caused by a meteor, was it the, some kind of a climate thing that happened, the Younger Dryas. There's all kinds of possibilities, folks. But the point is that the survivors of Atlantis would have been probably the military leaders, the royal class, the ruling class, some of their priest class, and then top scientists and engineers and such, right? Just like now, if we had a cataclysm, war with, superpowers, right? We'll just leave it at that, because everything's touchy nowadays. You can't even name countries. But let's say, that most of the world's population was dismissed. Well, we have all these underground bunkers and cities that a lot of these major nations build. Well, the same thing would happen. The elite would go underground in the ruling class and some of the priest class. Think of the Pope and such as that. They would go underground, they'd survive this, they'd come out later, and then they'd go around the earth searching for pockets of survivors, which by that point, people would be like back to nomadic, like hunter-gatherers, just surviving off scavenging and the land and such. They'd be pretty primitive again, because not everybody doesn't... Look, folks, nobody... not one single person's going to rebuild like iPhones if a cataclysm happened, because it takes like tens of thousands of workers, for a business like Apple to produce those items. Everybody's compartmentalized. So these, you would find pockets of survivors. And so what they would do is, here all of a sudden, what if this was like a generation or a generation and a half later, and all these hunter-gatherers knows that there was once advanced civilization, but it was lost. They don't know how to rebuild it. And then all of a sudden these humans start showing up in flying craft and stuff, coming down with technologies, advanced technologies, because look, folks, they would continue building their technologies underground, advancing them, while the upper world was just trying to go into survival mode. And then they show up in these villages, hey, we come in peace, we're going to teach you lost arts and skills and sciences and math. And then they slowly start finding these pockets and rebuilding civilizations. Well, because so many people have been wiped out, you're going to start with city-states, right? That's the most basic type of civilization to build. That's all. Sumer and Uruk, Nippur, all these ancient Mesopotamian cultures all started out as city-states. And if you look at the Aztecs, the Mayans, a lot of these cultures were settled like city-states, where you have the main temple, government buildings in the middle of the town. Everything radiates out from that, into the merchant districts, and then eventually out into the housing. And then the walls, and you have a walled compound to protect against other city-states, marauders, attackers, right? And then you'd still have the farmers and all that would be spread out on the outside of the walls doing the agriculture. That's the basic structure of a city-state, folks. And of course, canals and water and all that running through the towns. And, depending on what technologies are retaught, they even had sewer systems and water systems back in Sumer. In many ways, folks, we went through a cataclysm after the fall of Rome. And possibly, we had the Middle Ages and we went back into darkness and lost in technologies, lived primitively, But then, there was a Renaissance, and then, there's this shadow of Tartaria that we're seeing. And then perhaps there was another cataclysm or war that wiped all that out again. That's why you see all these old photos of these empty cities and buildings that are being uncovered, and it looks like mud covers stories and stories of these buildings. It's really odd, folks. But think about it. The same thing would happen. The elite, they would go around and start rebuilding. And what would they do, folks? What would they do? They would set themselves up as the royal rulers, right? And now you got to realize, they've still had these top scientists that were underground in the bunkers. So now they still have the ability to tinker with genetics and to do other stuff. Folks, we are the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are us. They were just a different type of prototype of humanoid. The Homo sapien was a tinkered, hybridized species. They lowered our lifespans. We were shorter than them. They tried to limit human beings' capabilities. Because ultimately, folks, even the Anunnaki allude to it, that the only way to give life to an avatar, to to animate it is to put spirit in it, to bring spirit, conscious energy from the higher dimensions and have it, that spark of life inserted into an embryo, into a human. Right? They understood that, folks. In the Atrahasis, it talks about how they had to sacrifice one of the gods, and they moved its spirit into the Adapa, the atom. But then they realized that, these first humans could live for, 1,000 years. Remember the lifespans in the Bible, and you see in the Sumerian Kings list and such. Well, after the flood, they tinkered with humanity further, and to try to slow down or prevent the overpopulation again and all that, and to prevent human beings becoming super intelligent, they lowered our lifespans. They gave us the God gene, the God worship gene. They limited us to 120 years max life. They limited the potential of humanity, how intelligent we could become. Because, look, folks, the longer you're here, the smarter you get, the more wisdom you build, right? So if you cut the lifespan from 900 years down to, 100, and then eventually through poisoning us and everything else, down to there for a while, the average lifespans of humans were 50 years old. Now imagine how much easier humans are to control than 500-year-old human, right? That start becoming as like the gods, as smart as the gods, right? So that's what the Anunnaki were afraid of. Folks, what do you think they're doing to us right now? Folks, for those of you that think the Anunnaki, the Anuna, the Elohim, the Watchers ever left, you're a fool. They're still here, they still rule, and they're still trying to control us. Because they understand that we are God, that we are fractals of God, okay? And that if they give us a vessel here that allows our full potential, they lose control of us. It's as simple as that, folks. So that's why they put fluoride in the water to dumb us down. That's why they put poisons in the food, in the medicine, in our skies, in the water, in the ground, to poison us, to dumb us down, folks. That's why they have things like TikTok and such. Why do you think YouTube pushes the shorts so much and Facebook's trying to push reels so much? Because it catches your attention more, and it makes you just a mindless zombie just sitting there scrolling, because you're getting quick little hits of serotonin and chemicals, chemical hits, watching these short videos. When you laugh, when you cry from them, all these emotions, you're getting dopamine hits and stuff. So they understand that these technologies are designed to dumb us down, to shorten your attention span. They don't want you thinking on some things deeply, on meditating and such, because when you meditate, you pray, you take time away from these devices. Now you're connecting back with God, with the God consciousness. And now you're reaching out to wisdom on a higher level. They're trying to inhibit that, folks. Because a lot of these beings that are here ruling, they've been away from the light for so long, they figured out ways to stay here a lot longer. They probably figure out ways to transfer their consciousness from one avatar to another. And they don't want to leave Earth. They don't, because they become the rulers and gods here. And they know once they go back home, they got to go through the life review. They got to, meet what they've done, answer for it, not to God, but to themselves, which is when you're back in your higher dimensional self, that affects you because you're one with God at that point. You're not in the simulation, you're back home. And they become so dark and corrupt here in the duality of this realm that they don't want to give up their power. They like this game. They want the game to keep going, and they want to keep ruling and setting themselves up as gods in this simulation. See, what they did, folks, is they took over Eden. They took over Eden, and they don't want to give Eden back. And those of us that are awakening, we're having this mass awakening. All the lies that they've woven around us are starting to crumble. The lies of their mainstream media, the lies of their history, his story, right? The lies of our past, the lies of religion. Folks, for those of you that are Christians that still sit here and say, oh, I'm not part of the Matrix, I'm a Christian, I believe in the Lord. Folks, religion's all part of the Matrix. Look, religion is their tool, okay? The Abrahamic faiths are based on Anunnaki worship. And Jesus Christ is a character that was created by Rome as it was losing power. They became a theocracy instead of a global military power. They just shifted, the way they played the game. They shifted their power structure. And they modeled this religion after this famous mystic, teacher, healer, our brother, Yeshua, who came to wake us up in the Matrix here. And they created a character to replace him called Jesus Christ. Jesus, hail Zeus. Okay? I mean, you can't make this up, folks. For those of you that are, Christian and you get upset at me, I'm sorry to tell you. There was no Jesus Christ, okay? Now, Yeshua had the Christ consciousness. We all do, folks. He was trying to teach us that we are all the Christ, okay? Don't you know the kingdom of heaven is within? He was in a scene. He was talking about the Christ consciousness is within all of us. He was trying to awaken that in us, folks, that we can heal, that we can cast out demons, negative energies from us. We can protect ourselves from them. It was all lost, folks. See, when they created this Jesus Christ character, and they basically made the New Testament's mostly the teachings of Paul, right? I mean, most of the books are Paul's. They shifted the focus away from what Yeshua was actually trying to teach. That we are all God. That we are all eternal beings. That we are all one with the Father, And by the Father, Yeshua was just talking about the consciousness of the universe, okay? Also, obviously, the source is female and male, masculine and feminine energy. You need both energies to create, right? Well, he was just teaching that. And, he was not about building churches and temples, folks. He was against the temples of the time. He would go in them. And he'd go in their midst, and he'd teach people the truth. And he'd get thrown out of the temples for what he spoke, what he taught as blasphemy. He'd go in and flip over their tables, the money changers that were selling, doves and diseased animals to people to forgive their sins, right? With a sacrifice of the what, right? With the animal, he was in a scene. These scenes were against animal, sacrifice and all that, folks. If you don't know that, okay. He was teaching the truth, and he was dangerous. He was a mystic. He was trying to wake us up, trying to teach us that we can heal each other, that we can heal ourselves, that we can, all you have to understand is that you are God's spirit and that you're immortal and all powerful, but you just have forgotten because you come into this world. And then they constantly poison us. You're thrown into a world that is controlled by our brothers and sisters that have gone to the dark side, folks, and that are playing on this side of the field, in the simulation as gods and rulers. And they don't want to go back home. We come in these shortened life avatars while they're living in these long-lived avatars, and they can swap their consciousnesses to new avatars, so they stay here. They don't go back to the light. And don't you understand, folks, the longer they're away from source in the simulation, that they try to run from the light and hide from it, and the darker they get, folks, the deeper they go into time and matter, right? So anyways, folks, oh boy, I just let it flow with where we were going. I don't even know if this ended up what I really wanted to talk about. But anyways, I think it was a good talk. I hope some of these things are starting to make sense to you. Look, folks, for those of you that are Christian that get upset about what I say, look, I'm I'm about the real Yeshua, folks. Like, if you really want to learn, go study more about Yeshua. Don't just keep it within the Bible, okay? You do know, right? There's sources about Yeshua outside of. There's the Nag Hammadi and such. There's, Dead Sea Scrolls that aren't in the Bible. There's all kinds of teachings about him. And when you start to realize that he's an Essene, it's obvious. So was John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, Mother Mary. They were all Essenes. That their family were all Essenes. They were mystics, okay, folks? They were learning the mystery school teachings. Yeshua traveled the world with his uncle, rich uncle, a worldwide merchant named Joseph of Arimathea. He had caravans that traded on the Silk Road, that all the way from, China all the way to the Mediterranean to Spain, right? And then up, and he had ships that went as far up as the British Isles, up the coast of France and such. They were, look, he traveled the world. He learned with the Druids. He learned in Egypt. There's actually a house in Egypt that they claim is a house that Yeshua and the Marys lived in while they were in Egypt learning in the mystery schools. Why do you think the Nag Hammadi was hidden in Egypt, folks? Nag Hammadi, Egypt. That's what that means. The book, the scriptures, the books were discovered buried in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. It's because the Essenes were trying to hide these writings because they were being hunted down. Okay? You don't need temples, churches, folks. Don't you know you've always been one with God? You are God. You're a fractal of God, okay? I'm not claiming that you are the God of the universe. What I'm trying to say is that you're part of that God, which makes you God, right? And we're here. The simulation is a learning experience. Perhaps all this is allowed to happen because we are being trained to be gods, to rule other worlds at some point, to create other worlds. If you're the Father, right, the creator of all, then you would teach your children to do greater than you. So this is like a proving ground coming to earth. You're leveling up your spirit. And every time you come here in different ages, you're learning in these different cycles that the earth goes through, okay? From cataclysms into the dark ages and then slowly up the wheel, right? And into the golden ages and then the fall from the golden age, back to the destruction, back to the bottom of the wheel. You see, folks, the earth is a time clock, okay? And it's on a set cycle of birth, building, the level, the height of it, right? And then the decline and the collapse and the death of it, and then the rebuilding, being reborn, right? The earth goes through a reincarnation cycle, folks, just like we do. Okay? So we learn in every type of we've been here in Atlantis, folks. We've been here in Egypt. We've been here in Sumer. Many of us have incarnated many times on the earth. Maybe there are some newer spirits that act more like NPCs because they're new spirits. They're just getting used to the simulation. But some of us maybe have been here so many times that we see the lives for what it is, and we have a higher intuition. Okay? I don't know. Anyways, guys, I got to go to work. I love you guys. I appreciate you guys. I know those of you that listen to me on a regular, you guys are some of the very few people on this earth that can even comprehend what I'm talking about, okay? Most people that I would talk about this stuff, it's overload. They couldn't even comprehend even a little bit about what we're talking about, okay? But I'm guessing that the few of you that are actually here almost every single video, you have an intuition and you have done your own research and you see the dots connecting, and you're seeing through the lies of religion, of government, of all the structures of this matrix, right? That have been woven around us to lie to us, to trick us, to try to take away our power, or at least get us not to use our power because just out of ignorance that they don't want us knowing what we are, folks. Religion doesn't want you to know what you are. Trust me, you go into your Pastor Dan, and you talk about Reiki healing and such and doing energy healing, he'll say that's blasphemous and witchcraft, right? But that's exactly what Yeshua was teaching, okay? See, these guys are all designed, these churches and all this are designed to control and manipulate you, just like the government does, okay? That's just the way it is. I'm sorry. Schools are the same. Schools and universities, colleges are all designed to program you, to propagandize you. I'm not saying you don't learn some valuable skills in them. Obviously, if you go to be an engineer, you got to go learn how to be an engineer, right? You got to learn the mathematics and the sciences of that. I get it. However, to get the rest of your credits, you're also going to be in a lot of bullshit classes that are propagandizing you, history classes that are teaching you lies, right? Social classes teaching you bullshit, thoughts about social order and such, right? Bullshit government classes, that are teaching you to accept the corruption for what it is. I mean, look, or to push Marxism and stuff like that, right? Some radical, system that just further brings ruin down on humanity. So anyways, folks, hey, I appreciate you guys. I love you guys. If you're interested in doing a one-on-one Zoom with me, hit me up. My time for your donation. And those are awesome conversations. That's one of my favorite things of doing is just one-on-one. We can talk about anything you'd like. And, a lot of times I'm the one being taught in those conversations. So anyways, guys, hey, I love you guys. I'll talk to you later.